On a clearing in the forests of West Africa, sometime around the year 1701, something happened that would be remembered for 3 centuries and counting. A priest named Okomfo Anokye, a man whose reputation for supernatural power had spread across every Akan state from the coast to the deep interior, raised his hands toward the sky and called upon the heavens to deliver a throne. The chiefs of a dozen independent Akan states sat in a semicircle, watching. Warriors lined the edges of the clearing, hands on their weapons, unsure whether they were witnessing a political ceremony or a spiritual event. The tension was suffocating. These chiefs had been rivals for generations. Their people had fought each other, raided each other's villages, sold each other into slavery. They had been brought here by a young leader named Osei Tutu, who had promised them something that sounded impossible: unity. A single nation forged from a dozen warring peoples. One identity where there had been many. One army where there had been chaos. Most of them didn't believe it. Some had come out of curiosity. Others had come because refusing Osei Tutu's invitation carried its own risks. A few had come because they were desperate enough to try anything, because the Denkyira Empire that ruled over all of them was squeezing the life out of their people, demanding tribute in gold and human beings. And none of them were strong enough to resist alone. Okomfo Anokye's voice rose above the murmur of the crowd. He spoke in words that mixed prayer with command, spiritual authority with political theater. He called upon the sky god, Nyame, to send a sign, to deliver a symbol so powerful that no chief could deny its meaning, to provide a throne that belonged not to any single ruler but to an entire people. And then, according to every account that has survived across 300 years of oral tradition, something fell from the sky. A golden stool, gleaming in the forest light, descending through the canopy and landing, gently, precisely, directly on the lap of Osei Tutu. The clearing erupted. Some chiefs fell to their knees. Others stood frozen, mouths open, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Warriors who had spent their lives trusting nothing but the weight of a sword in their hand found themselves staring at an object that seemed to have materialized from the realm of the gods. Okomfo Anokye's voice cut through the chaos. He declared that the Golden Stool contained the Sun Sum, the collective soul of every Akan person present and every Akan person yet to be born. It was not a throne to be sat upon, it was a living spiritual entity. Whoever the stool chose would lead, and the stool had chosen Osei Tutu. He then issued a warning that would echo through centuries. If the Golden Stool is ever lost, the Ashanti nation dies. Not its government, not its army, the nation itself. The soul of the people would be destroyed, scattered, extinguished forever. The stool is the nation is the stool. Protect it with everything you have, because without it, you are nothing. Now, did a golden stool actually fall from the sky? Almost certainly not. Modern historians believe Okomfo Anokye had the stool hidden in the tree canopy and released it through a mechanism of ropes and branches at the precise dramatic moment. It was, in all likelihood, the most sophisticated piece of political theater in pre-colonial African history. But here's what matters more than whether the stool fell from the sky or from a tree. It worked. In that single moment, Okomfo Anokye and Osei Tutu accomplished something that no amount of military force could have achieved. They created a nation, not through conquest, not through coercion, through belief. A dozen chiefs who had walked into that clearing as independent rulers walked out as members of a single people, bound together by a shared symbol so powerful that they would fight and die for it for the next 3 centuries. The question is, how? How did a young chief from an insignificant little chieftaincy convince a dozen rival rulers to surrender their independence? How did he find a priest brilliant enough to manufacture a national origin myth in real time? And how did the empire they built together become so powerful that the British would need 4 separate wars spanning nearly a century to bring it down? To answer those questions, we need to go back decades before the Golden Stool ceremony, to a time when the man who would build Africa's greatest warrior empire was a homeless exile with nothing to his name except an education he had stolen from the people who held him captive. The world that produced Osei Tutu was the forest zone of what is now southern Ghana, a region so densely packed with gold that European merchants had named it the Gold Coast. By the mid-1600s, this region was home to dozens of small Akan-speaking states, each governed by its own chief, each fiercely independent, and each caught in the gravitational pull of a single dominant power: the Denkyira Empire. Denkyira was the superpower of the Gold Coast. It had risen to dominance through a combination of military aggression, control of the gold trade, and a system of tributary relationships that extracted wealth from every smaller state in the region. The Denkyira king, or Denkyira Hene, ruled from a court that dripped with gold. Literally. Gold dust covered the floors, gold ornaments decorated every surface. Gold weights, used to measure the precious metal that was the foundation of the regional economy, were crafted into miniature works of art that told stories and encoded proverbs. Denkyira's wealth was obscene, and every ounce of it was extracted from the labor and resources of the vassal states that lived under its boot. The tribute system was designed to do more than generate wealth. It was designed to humiliate. Vassal chiefs were required to appear personally at the Denkyira court to deliver their payments, crawling on their hands and knees before the Denkyira Hene. They were required to provide gold, kola nuts, and most painfully, human beings. Enslaved people from their own communities sent to the Denkyira court to serve or to be sold to the European merchants on the coast. Every vassal chief in the region burned with resentment, but none of them was strong enough to challenge Denkyira alone. The empire's army was the largest in the Gold Coast, equipped with European firearms purchased through its monopoly on the coastal gold trade. Any chief who refused tribute would find his chieftaincy destroyed, his people scattered, and his name erased from memory. Into this world of gold and subjugation, around the year 1660, Osei Tutu was born in Kumasi. Kumasi in the 1660s was nobody's idea of a future imperial capital. It was a small Akan chieftaincy in the forest interior, politically insignificant, militarily weak, and crushed under Denkyira's tributary demands. The paramount chief of Kumasi held his position at the pleasure of the Denkyira Hene, and everyone knew it. Kumasi paid its tribute, kept its head down, and survived by being too small and too poor to be worth destroying. Osei Tutu was born into the Kumasi royal family, which sounds more impressive than it was. Being royalty in Kumasi in the 1660s was like being the captain of a sinking boat. You had a title, but the title came with obligations to a foreign overlord who could remove you at any moment. His early years were shaped by the daily reality of subjugation, watching his family's elders humiliate themselves before Denkyira's representatives, watching his people's gold and labor flow outward to enrich a foreign court, watching the quiet rage build in the eyes of every adult around him. As a young man, Osei Tutu was sent to the Denkyira court. The official reason was education, the common practice of vassal states sending their young royals to the imperial court to learn governance and diplomacy. The unofficial reason was hostage-taking. A prince held at the Denkyira court was insurance against his family's good behavior. If Kumasi's chief decided to resist Denkyira's demands, his nephew's life would be the first cost of rebellion. What neither the Denkyira king nor his court advisors anticipated was what Osei Tutu would do with his time as a hostage. He watched everything. He studied the Denkyira military system, how they organized their forces, how they deployed their firearms, how they maintained discipline, how they supplied their armies during campaigns. He analyzed the Denkyira political structure, identifying which vassal relationships were strong and which were maintained purely through fear. He mapped the fault lines in the empire, the resentments, the rivalries, the suppressed hatreds between Denkyira and its subjects. He also studied Denkyira's relationship with the European merchants on the coast. The Dutch, the British, and the Danes all maintained trading posts along the Gold Coast, competing for access to the gold and enslaved people that the interior states produced. Denkyira had positioned itself as the primary intermediary in this trade, controlling which African states could access European goods, especially firearms, and which couldn't. This monopoly was the foundation of Denkyira's military superiority. They had guns because they controlled the trade. No one could challenge them because no one else had guns. Osei Tutu memorized every detail, every strength, every weakness, every opportunity. He was assembling a blueprint for revolution inside the palace of the people he intended to destroy. But his education at the Denkyira court was interrupted by a crisis that would prove pivotal to his future. According to oral tradition, Osei Tutu had an affair with one of the Denkyira king's wives. Whether this actually happened or whether it was a political accusation manufactured by Osei Tutu's enemies at court is debatable. What isn't debatable is the result. Osei Tutu was forced to flee the Denkyira court or face execution. He ran east to the kingdom of Akwamu. If the Denkyira court had been Osei Tutu's military academy, the Akwamu court became his graduate school. Akwamu was a rising power in the eastern Gold Coast, and its political and military systems were different from Denkyira's in ways that fascinated the young exile. Where Denkyira relied on brute force and intimidation, Akwamu used a more sophisticated combination of diplomacy, intelligence networks, and strategic alliance building. Where Denkyira's vassal system was designed to humiliate and extract, Akwamu's relationships with its allies involved genuine power sharing and mutual benefit. Osei Tutu absorbed everything. He studied Akwamu's military tactics, which emphasized mobility and surprise over the static, firepower-heavy approach that Denkyira favored. He learned how Akwamu's intelligence network gathered information about rival states, using merchants and travelers as spies. He observed how Akwamu's chief maintained loyalty among his subordinates through a combination of generosity, shared decision-making, and the strategic distribution of trade profits. And in Akwamu, Osei Tutu met the man who would become the co-architect of everything he would build, Okomfo Anokye. Anokye was a priest, but the word priest doesn't remotely capture what he was. He was a spiritual leader, a political strategist, a psychologist, and a performer of the highest order. He understood something that most political leaders of his era, in Africa and everywhere else, had not fully grasped. Power is not just physical, it's not just military. Power, at its most fundamental level, is a story that people believe. A king is only a king because enough people agree that he's a king. An empire is only an empire because enough people accept its authority. Change the story, and you change everything. Anokye and Osei Tutu recognized in each other something rare. Osei Tutu had the political vision, the military knowledge, and the personal charisma to lead. Anokye had the spiritual authority, the psychological insight, and the theatrical genius to make people believe. Separately, they were talented. Together, they would be transformative. The two men spent years at the Akwamu court, planning, debating, refining a vision that grew more ambitious with each passing month. They didn't want to simply free Kumasi from Denkyira's control. They didn't want to replace one overlord with another. They wanted to create something that had never existed in the Gold Coast, a unified Akan nation. A state so large, so powerful, and so cohesive that no external force could threaten it. The problem was that the Akan peoples had never been unified. They shared a language, family, and certain cultural traditions, but politically they were fragmented into dozens of independent chieftaincies that spent as much time fighting each other as they did resisting foreign domination. Every previous attempt to unite the Akan states had failed because no chief was willing to surrender his sovereignty to another chief. The jealousies were too deep, the rivalries were too old. The distrust was too fundamental. Osei Tutu and Anokye understood that conventional politics couldn't solve this problem. No amount of negotiation, no alliance of convenience, no military conquest could create genuine unity among people who had spent generations defining themselves against each other. They needed something more powerful than politics. They needed religion. They needed myth. They needed the Golden Stool. But that ceremony, the founding miracle of the Ashanti nation, was still years away. First, Osei Tutu had to go home. And home, when he finally returned to it, was a place with nothing to offer except the memory of humiliation and the burning desire to turn that memory into fuel. Around 1680, word reached Osei Tutu in Akwamu that his uncle, the paramount chief of Kumasi, had died. The chieftaincy needed a new leader. Osei Tutu was the most eligible candidate from the royal lineage, but eligibility and certainty are different things in Akan politics. The selection of a new chief involved the Queen Mother, the Council of Elders, and a process of consultation that could elevate anyone from the royal family. Osei Tutu returned to Kumasi with Okomfo Anokye at his side. He came back carrying 2 decades of education that no one in Kumasi could match. He had studied the military systems of 2 major empires. He had mapped the political fault lines of the entire Gold Coast. He had developed a plan to transform the Akan world. And he had a partner whose spiritual authority and theatrical genius could make that plan real. The Council of Elders chose Osei Tutu as chief. But the man who took the stool of Kumasi in 1680 inherited a kingdom that barely deserved the name. Kumasi controlled a few villages and the surrounding forest. Its population was modest. Its military was a collection of warriors with traditional weapons, a handful of firearms, and no organizational structure capable of challenging any significant power. Its treasury was perpetually drained by Denkyira's tribute demands, and its people were demoralized by generations of subjugation. Osei Tutu looked at what he had and understood that he needed to build from nothing. But he also understood something his predecessors had not. Kumasi's weakness was not permanent. It was a condition created by Denkyira's system, and systems could be broken. He began immediately. His first priority was military reform. The Kumasi fighting force he inherited was organized along traditional lines, with warriors grouped by clan and led by clan elders whose military qualifications were hereditary rather than earned. Osei Tutu dismantled this system entirely. He reorganized the military into a structure based on merit and function, creating specialized units for scouting, flanking, frontal assault, and reserve deployment. He assigned command positions based on demonstrated ability rather than bloodline. He drilled his warriors relentlessly, implementing training techniques he had learned at both the Denkyira and Akwamu courts. He taught them European-style volley fire for the firearms they possessed and developed tactics for integrating gunfire with traditional close combat weapons. He created a signal system using drums and horns that allowed commanders to coordinate movements across battlefields where direct communication was impossible. And he imposed a level of discipline that Kumasi's military had never experienced. Men who broke formation were punished. Men who fled were executed. Men who fought with distinction were rewarded with gold, status, and authority. But Osei Tutu understood that a reformed military meant nothing if Kumasi stood alone. One chieftaincy, no matter how well organized, could not defeat the Denkyira Empire. He needed allies. He needed the other Akan states that groaned under Denkyira's tribute system to join him, and that was a far more difficult challenge than training soldiers. The problem was structural and psychological. Every Akan chief valued his independence above almost everything else. The chieftaincy stool was not just a political position. It was a spiritual office, connecting the living chief to the ancestors who had held the position before him. Asking a chief to subordinate his stool to another chief's authority was asking him to betray his ancestors. It was, in the Akan worldview, something close to sacrilege. Osei Tutu tried diplomacy first. He sent messengers to neighboring chiefs proposing a military alliance against Denkyira. The responses ranged from cautious interest to outright rejection. The chief of Dwaban, one of the more powerful nearby states, reportedly told Osei Tutu's messenger, "Every generation produces a young man who wants to fight Denkyira. Every generation buries him. Why should I join my people's graves to his?" The chief of Kokofu was blunter. "When Kumasi can field an army larger than my bodyguard, I will consider an alliance. Until then, pay your tribute and stop making noise." Osei Tutu absorbed these rejections without visible anger. He had expected them. He knew that rational argument would not convince these men. They had rational reasons to refuse. The risk of challenging Denkyira was enormous. The history of failed rebellions was long and bloody. Every chief who calculated the odds reached the same conclusion. Submission was safer than resistance. Logic would not unite the Akan peoples. Fear of Denkyira would not unite them. Only one thing could unite them: a force powerful enough to override political calculation, historical experience, and rational self-interest. Belief. This was Okomfo Anokye's moment. The priest had been working alongside Osei Tutu since their return to Kumasi, building his reputation through a series of demonstrations that combined genuine herbal knowledge, psychological manipulation, and what can only be described as world-class showmanship. He healed the sick using remedies he had learned from healers across the Gold Coast. He made predictions about harvests and weather patterns that proved accurate, often enough to seem supernatural. He performed rituals that left witnesses shaken and convinced that they were in the presence of someone who operated on a plane of existence beyond normal human experience. Anokye's reputation grew until it extended far beyond Kumasi's borders. Chiefs from distant states sent messengers asking for his counsel. Traders carried stories of his powers along the commercial routes. Even Denkyira's court heard rumors about the extraordinary priest who served the young chief of Kumasi. When Anokye's reputation had reached the level that he and Osei Tutu required, they made their move. Osei Tutu sent a second round of invitations to the Akan chiefs. But this time, the invitation didn't come from a minor chief proposing a military alliance. It came accompanied by a message from Okomfo Anokye himself, declaring that the sky god Nyame had revealed to him that the Akan peoples were destined to unite under a single authority, and that those who refused to attend the sacred ceremony would face spiritual consequences that no army could inflict and no wall could stop. The combination of Anokye's growing reputation and the implied threat of supernatural punishment proved more persuasive than any political argument. Chiefs who had dismissed Osei Tutu's first overtures now found themselves reluctant to dismiss a priest whose spiritual authority seemed to be confirmed by observable results. One by one, they agreed to attend. The gathering took place near Kumasi, in a clearing in the forest that Anokye had selected for its spiritual significance. The chiefs arrived with their retinues, warriors, and suspicion. They sat in the semicircle that Akan protocol demanded, arranged by seniority and status, each man acutely aware of his position relative to every other man present. Anokye had prepared the ceremony with the meticulous attention to detail of a military campaign. Every element was calculated for maximum psychological impact. The timing was chosen to coincide with a specific astronomical alignment that Anokye used to reinforce the sense of cosmic significance. The location was prepared in advance, with specific trees cleared and specific sightlines arranged to ensure that every chief had an unobstructed view of what was about to happen. Then came the stool. Whether it descended from a hidden mechanism in the tree canopy, whether it was produced through sleight of hand on a scale that would impress a modern stage magician, or whether something genuinely inexplicable occurred in that forest clearing is ultimately less important than what happened next. Anokye declared that the Golden Stool contained the sun sum of the Ashanti nation, not Kumasi, not any single chieftaincy, the Ashanti nation, a new identity that transcended the old divisions. He declared that the stool had chosen Osei Tutu as the Asantehene, the king of all the Ashanti, but he added a crucial detail that revealed the political genius beneath the spiritual theatre. The Golden Stool did not belong to Osei Tutu. It belonged to the nation. Even the Asantehene could not sit on it. It would rest on its own throne, on its own blanket, treated as a living entity with rights and dignity of its own. This was the masterstroke. Every Akan chief understood what Anokye was really saying. You are not being asked to submit to Osei Tutu's authority. You are being asked to join something larger than any individual ruler. Your stools, your ancestral authority, your identity, these remain yours. But above all of them sits a symbol that belongs to everyone and to no one. You are not losing your independence. You are gaining membership in something sacred. Anokye then performed a ritual that cemented the new identity in ways that went beyond symbolism. He asked each chief to contribute hair clippings and fingernail cuttings, which were mixed with sacred ingredients and incorporated into the Golden Stool. This was not mere theatre. In Akan spiritual belief, hair and nails carry a person's spiritual essence. By embedding pieces of themselves in the stool, the chiefs were literally binding their spiritual identity to the new nation. It was a contract written not in ink, but in the substance of their own bodies. Some chiefs resisted. The chief of Dwaben, the same man who had mocked Osei Tutu's first alliance proposal, hesitated visibly. According to oral tradition, Anokye turned to him directly and spoke words that every person in the clearing could hear. The sky god sees your heart, Dwabenhene. He knows whether you stand with the Ashanti or apart from them, and he will remember your choice long after your body returns to the earth. The Dwabenhene contributed his hair and nails. By the end of the ceremony, every chief present had committed himself and his people to the Ashanti Union. The Golden Stool sat on its own throne at the center of the clearing, surrounded by the chiefs whose spiritual essence it now contained. A nation that had not existed when the sun rose that morning existed when the sun set. But creating a nation is one thing. Making it function is something else entirely. And the system that Osei Tutu and Anokye built in the months following the Golden Stool ceremony was as revolutionary as the ceremony itself. The Ashanti Confederacy, as the new state was structured, was unlike any political entity the Gold Coast had ever seen. It was not a centralized monarchy where the king's word was absolute law. It was not a loose alliance where members could withdraw at will. It was something in between, a sophisticated federal structure that balanced central authority with local autonomy in ways that European political theorists wouldn't fully articulate for another century. Each member state retained its own chief, its own stool, its own internal governance. Chiefs continued to manage their local affairs, settle disputes, collect revenues, and maintain their ancestral traditions. But in matters of war, foreign policy, and interstate disputes, authority rested with the Asantehene and the Ashanti National Council, a body composed of all the member chiefs meeting together to debate and decide. The council was not a rubber stamp. Chiefs could and did argue with the Asantehene. Decisions required genuine consensus. A chief who felt his concerns were being ignored could appeal to the council, and the Asantehene was expected to listen. It was, in a meaningful sense, a constitutional monarchy with checks on royal power that many European kingdoms of the same period lacked. Osei Tutu also established a set of laws that governed relationships between member states. Warfare between Ashanti members was prohibited. Trade disputes were to be resolved through the council rather than by force. A common military obligation was established, requiring every member state to contribute warriors when the Asante called for a national campaign. And, most significantly, a shared system of weights and measures for gold was implemented, creating a common economic framework that facilitated trade and reduced the fraud that had plagued interstate commerce. The administrative structure was supported by a network of functionaries that would grow increasingly sophisticated over the following decades. Tax collectors, judicial officials, diplomatic envoys, military commanders, and intelligence operatives all served the central authority while respecting local autonomy. It was a system designed by a man who had studied two empires from the inside and understood both the strengths of centralized power and the resentments it created when applied without restraint. Okomfo Anokye added spiritual infrastructure to complement Osei Tutu's political framework. He established a calendar of national festivals that brought the Ashanti people together across their various local identities. He created rituals that reinforced the common identity symbolized by the Golden Stool. He positioned himself as the spiritual guardian of the nation, a role that gave him authority independent of the political hierarchy and that served as an additional check on the Asante's power. Together, Osei Tutu and Anokye had created something extraordinary, not just a military alliance, not just a political federation, a nation with a shared identity, shared institutions, shared spiritual foundation, and a symbol of unity so powerful that people would kill and die for it for the next 3 centuries. But a nation born from the desire for liberation doesn't become real until it liberates itself. And the Denkyira Empire was still out there, still demanding tribute, still humiliating vassal chiefs, still believing that its dominance was permanent and unchallengeable. The confrontation that would determine whether the Ashanti nation was a genuine power or a temporary fantasy was about to begin. And it would start, as all great conflicts start, with an insult so brazen that it left no room for compromise. In 1699, the Denkyira Empire, heard the reports from his spies about what was happening in the forest interior. A young chief in Kumasi was building alliances. A priest was performing ceremonies. There were rumors of a golden stool and a new nation. Denkyira listened to these reports and felt something between amusement and contempt. Kumasi was nothing, a forest village that existed only because Denkyira permitted it to exist. This Osei Tutu was just the latest in a long line of petty chiefs who dreamed of independence and then woke up to find Denkyira's army at their doorstep. The solution was simple: remind Kumasi of its place. Denkyira sent a messenger to Osei Tutu's court, carrying a golden scale and a message that was designed to be as humiliating as possible. The Denkyira demands his tribute. Weigh your gold on this scale. And if you cannot fill it, weigh your blood instead. The messenger delivered the message in front of Osei Tutu's full court. Every chief in the Ashanti Confederacy heard it. Every warrior present heard it. The insult was not just to Osei Tutu, it was to every person who had bound their identity to the Golden Stool. Osei Tutu took the golden scale from the messenger. He held it up so everyone in the court could see it. Then he looked at the messenger and spoke clearly enough for every ear in the room. Tell Denkyira that I will fill his scale, but not with gold. I will fill it with the weight of Denkyira's defeat. He will not need to weigh tribute again, because there will be no Denkyira left to collect it. The messenger returned to Denkyira with Osei Tutu's response. The Denkyira's reaction was exactly what Osei Tutu intended: rage, blinding, irrational, overconfident rage. Denkyira immediately began assembling the largest army Denkyira had ever fielded. He would crush this insect personally. He would destroy Kumasi so thoroughly that no one would ever again dare to refuse Denkyira's tribute. He had no idea that he was doing exactly what Osei Tutu wanted him to do. Denkyira assembled an army that reflected Denkyira's status as the dominant power of the Gold Coast. Contemporary estimates suggest he gathered between 30,000 and 40,000 warriors, drawn from Denkyira's core territories and reinforced by contingents from vassal states who had no choice but to answer the Denkyira call to arms. The army was equipped with a significant number of European firearms purchased through Denkyira's monopoly on the coastal gold trade. Its commanders were experienced veterans of the campaigns that had built and maintained the empire over decades. By every conventional measure, it was the most powerful military force in the region. Ntim was confident to the point of recklessness. He brought his entire court with him on the campaign, including his wives, his servants, his treasury, and the sacred objects that symbolized Denkyira's spiritual authority. He intended this to be not just a military operation, but a spectacle, a demonstration so overwhelming that it would crush the spirit of resistance across the Gold Coast for a generation. He wanted every vassal chief in the region to witness what happened to people who defied Denkyira. He also brought something that would prove critical to the outcome of the battle, though not in the way he intended. Among the sacred objects in his baggage train was a document. A note of alliance, sealed with gold, that represented Denkyira's exclusive trade agreement with the Dutch at Elmina Castle on the coast. This document was, in effect, the key to Denkyira's power. It guaranteed Denkyira's monopoly on European trade, which meant monopoly access to firearms, which meant military superiority over every other state in the interior. Whoever held this document controlled the most important economic relationship on the Gold Coast. Ntim brought it with him because it was too valuable to leave behind. He would soon wish he had buried it in the deepest hole he could find. Osei Tutu had been preparing for this confrontation since the day he returned to Kumasi. Every alliance he had built, every military reform he had implemented, every moment of the Golden Stool ceremony had been designed to produce a force capable of facing Denkyira in the field and winning. Now that the moment had arrived, he revealed a level of strategic planning that went far beyond what anyone on either side expected. His first move was intelligence. Osei Tutu had spent years cultivating informants within the Denkyira system, merchants who traded in Denkyira's markets, vassal chiefs who secretly resented their overlord, even servants within the Denkyira court who passed information along networks that Okomfo Anokye had established. By the time Ntim army began its march toward Ashanti territory, Osei Tutu knew its size, its composition, its route of advance, and the location of the Denkyira command position. His second move was psychological. Osei Tutu sent messengers to every vassal state that Denkyira had forced to contribute troops to the campaign. The messages were simple and devastating. You march with Denkyira today because you fear Denkyira's power, but Denkyira's power ends tomorrow. When the battle is over, you will need to explain to the Ashanti nation why you chose to fight against the Golden Stool. Think carefully about which side you want to be standing on when the dust settles. The messages had an immediate and corrosive effect. Vassal contingents that had already been reluctant to fight for their oppressor now had an additional reason to drag their feet. Several units that were supposed to reinforce Ntim flanks would mysteriously fail to arrive at their assigned positions when the battle began. Others would fight with a notable lack of enthusiasm. A few would switch sides entirely at the critical moment. His third move was tactical. Osei Tutu chose the battlefield. He selected a site near the town of Feyiase, in the forested terrain between Denkyira's territory and the Ashanti heartland. The location was deliberate. Dense forest limited the effectiveness of firearms, Denkyira's primary technological advantage. The terrain channeled movement along predictable paths, allowing a smaller force to control the approaches and eliminate the numerical advantage of a larger army. And the forest provided concealment for the ambush positions that Osei Tutu's plan required. The Ashanti force that Osei Tutu assembled numbered approximately 20,000 warriors. Smaller than Ntimgyakari's army, but better organized, more highly motivated, and fighting on terrain they had chosen specifically to neutralize their enemy's advantages. Every man in the Ashanti formation knew what he was fighting for. Not tribute, not territory, not the ambitions of a single chief. The Golden Stool, the soul of their nation, the freedom of their people. The difference between fighting for a cause and fighting because your overlord commanded it would prove decisive. Osei Tutu organized his forces into a formation that drew on everything he had learned during his years of exile. The core of the Ashanti army was arranged in a pattern that later European observers would compare to a crescent or a set of closing jaws. The center was held by a strong but deliberately restrained force whose job was not to attack but to absorb the enemy's initial advance, to hold firm, to draw the Denkyira army deeper into the prepared killing zone. On both flanks, hidden in the forest, Osei Tutu positioned his strongest and most aggressive units, held in reserve with explicit orders not to move until the signal was given. Behind the center, concealed by the terrain, Osei Tutu placed a mobile reserve under the command of one of his most trusted chiefs. This reserve had a single mission. When the flanking units engaged and the Denkyira formation began to fragment, the reserve would drive through the center of the enemy army directly at Ntimgyakari's command position. Cut off the head, and the body dies. It was a plan of extraordinary sophistication. It required precise timing, disciplined execution, and the ability of multiple independent units to coordinate their actions across a densely forested battlefield where visibility was limited to a few dozen yards. Most armies of the period, in Africa or anywhere else, couldn't have pulled it off. The Ashanti army that Osei Tutu had built over the previous 2 decades could. The Battle of Feyiase began in the early morning of 1701. The exact date is uncertain, lost in the gap between oral tradition and written record, but the details of the engagement have been preserved with the kind of specificity that suggests multiple eyewitness accounts were incorporated into the oral tradition. Ntimgyakari's army advanced along the forest path toward the Ashanti positions, with the confidence of a force that expected its reputation to do half the work. The Denkyira vanguard, heavy infantry supported by musketeers, pushed forward through the dense undergrowth, expecting to encounter scattered resistance that would dissolve before their firepower. What they encountered instead was Osei Tutu's center, dug into prepared positions along a low ridge that crossed the forest path. The Ashanti center opened fire with their own muskets, less numerous than Denkyira's, but employed with devastating accuracy from concealed positions. The Denkyira vanguard stalled, caught in a crossfire that they couldn't effectively return because they couldn't see their attackers clearly through the forest canopy. Ntimgyakari, positioned behind his front lines with his command group and personal guard, received reports of the resistance and ordered his full force forward. This was the conventional response. Overwhelm the defense with numbers, push through the resistance, use the weight of 30,000 men to crush whatever was in front of them. It was exactly the reaction Osei Tutu had planned for. As the Denkyira army pushed deeper into the forest, compressing along the path and the surrounding terrain to bring maximum pressure against the Ashanti center, the jaws of the trap began to close. Osei Tutu's center fought stubbornly, giving ground slowly, making the Denkyira pay for every yard of forest in blood, but always falling back, always drawing the enemy forward, always pulling the bulk of Ntimgyakari's army deeper into the killing zone. The Denkyira commanders, focused on the resistance in front of them, didn't notice that the forest on both their flanks had gone unnaturally quiet. The birds had stopped singing, the insects had gone silent. The kind of silence that falls over a forest when it is filled with thousands of human beings holding their breath and waiting. The signal came from Osei Tutu's position behind the center, the sound of a specific drum pattern that every Ashanti commander had memorized during the weeks of preparation. The pattern meant one thing. Now, the forest exploded. From both flanks simultaneously, thousands of Ashanti warriors erupted from concealment and slammed into the sides of the Denkyira column. The Denkyira army, stretched along the forest path in a formation designed for frontal assault, suddenly found itself being attacked from 3 directions. The flanking forces didn't just fire into the enemy formation, they charged. Warriors armed with swords, spears and axes crashed into Denkyira units that were facing the wrong direction, packed too tightly to maneuver, and unable to bring their firearms to bear against an enemy that was already inside their formation. The sound was overwhelming. War cries from thousands of throats, the clash of metal on metal, the crack of muskets fired at point-blank range, the screaming of wounded men, the crash of bodies through undergrowth. The forest canopy trapped the noise, amplifying it, turning the battlefield into a cathedral of violence where no one could hear commands, no one could coordinate, and no one could think about anything except the enemy directly in front of their face. Ntimgyakari's army began to fragment. Units that tried to turn to face the flanking attacks exposed their backs to the center force, which had stopped retreating and was now advancing aggressively. Units that tried to maintain their position against the center were torn apart by the flanking forces. Communication between the Denkyira commanders collapsed entirely. Officers shouted orders that no one could hear. Drummers beat signals that no one could interpret through the chaos. The carefully organized Denkyira army devolved into a disjointed mass of men fighting individually in small groups without coordination or direction. And then Osei Tutu committed his reserve. The mobile force that had been concealed behind the center launched directly through the gap that the center's initial retreat had created and that the center's subsequent advance was now widening. The reserve drove like a spear through the increasingly fragmented Denkyira formation, heading directly for the command position where Ntimgyakari's banner was still visible above the forest canopy. The Denkyira king's personal guard fought ferociously. These were elite warriors, handpicked for their loyalty and their combat ability, and they understood that the battle's outcome would be decided wherever their king stood or fell. The fighting around Ntimgyakari's position was the most intense of the entire engagement, a concentrated hurricane of close-quarters combat where the distance between combatants was measured in inches rather than yards. Ntimgyakari himself fought. Whatever else can be said about the Denkyira Hain, he was not a coward. He drew his sword and engaged the Ashanti warriors who broke through his guard, fighting with the desperation of a man who understood that his empire was dying around him. It wasn't enough. The Ashanti reserve, reinforced by units from the flanking forces that had completed their initial assault and were now converging on the Denkyira center, overwhelmed the royal guard. Ntimgyakari was killed. The accounts differ on the exact circumstances. Some traditions say he was cut down in hand-to-hand combat. Others say he was struck by a musket ball. A few suggest he was captured alive and executed on the field. What every tradition agrees on is that by the time the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the Denkyira Hain was dead and his army was in total collapse. The destruction of the Denkyira army at Feyiase was comprehensive. Thousands of Denkyira soldiers were killed in the battle itself. Thousands more were killed or captured during the pursuit that followed. Vassal contingents that had been forced to march with Denkyira threw down their weapons and surrendered. Some of them actively helping the Ashanti forces identify Denkyira loyalists who were trying to escape. Ntimgyakari's camp, with its treasury, its sacred objects, its court and its servants, fell into Ashanti hands intact. And among the captured objects was the document that would reshape the Gold Coast's economic geography overnight: the Dutch Trade Agreement. The piece of paper that guaranteed Denkyira's monopoly on European firearms and trade goods. Osei Tutu now held the key to the most important commercial relationship in West Africa. The young chief from an insignificant forest village who had been sent to the Denkyira court as a hostage had destroyed the Denkyira Empire, killed its king, captured its treasury, and seized control of its most valuable asset. All in a single day. The aftermath of Feyiase transformed the political landscape of the Gold Coast with a speed that stunned everyone, including possibly Osei Tutu himself. States that had been Denkyira's vassals rushed to pledge allegiance to the Ashanti. Chiefs who had mocked Osei Tutu's first alliance proposals now presented themselves at his court with gifts and declarations of loyalty. The Ashanti Confederacy, which had been a collection of forest chieftaincies united by a ceremony and a stool, was suddenly the dominant power of the Gold Coast, controlling territory that dwarfed anything the Denkyira had held. Osei Tutu handled the transition with the same strategic intelligence that had characterized everything he had done since returning from exile. He didn't simply impose Ashanti authority on the conquered Denkyira territories. He incorporated them into the Confederacy using the same framework he had built for the original member states. Former Denkyira vassals were offered membership, not subjugation. Their chiefs retained their stools. Their local governance was respected. They were asked to contribute to the national military and to participate in the council system. In return, they received the protection of the Ashanti military, access to the trade networks that Ashanti now controlled, and membership in a political entity that was clearly the most powerful force in the region. Some states resisted. The Akiem, a powerful people to the east, refused to accept Ashanti dominance and would become a persistent military challenge. Several former Denkyira loyalists attempted to organize resistance, but found that without the Denkyira army, without the Denkyira treasury, and without the Denkyira trade monopoly, they had nothing to resist with. The European merchants on the coast watched the transformation with a mixture of fascination and anxiety. The Dutch at Elmina, who had built their most profitable trade relationship with Denkyira, suddenly found themselves dealing with a new and unfamiliar power. Osei Tutu sent envoys to the Dutch fort, carrying the captured trade agreement, and a message that demonstrated his understanding of European commercial psychology with uncomfortable precision. "The Denkyira are finished," his envoy told the Dutch governor. "The agreement you made with them belongs to us now. You may continue trading on the Gold Coast, but the terms will be different. The Denkyira were content to sell you gold at prices that suited your convenience. The Ashanti will sell you gold at prices that reflect its actual value. You are welcome to accept these new terms. You are also welcome to leave. But you are not welcome to trade with our enemies, arm our rivals, or play games with people who conquered an empire in a single afternoon." The Dutch, who had spent decades dealing with African rulers they considered politically unsophisticated, found themselves negotiating with a state that understood leverage, monopoly, and the dynamics of supply and demand as clearly as any European trading house. Osei Tutu had studied the European merchants during his years at the Denkyira court. He knew exactly how much they needed Gold Coast gold. He knew they had no alternative source, and he knew that this knowledge was worth more than any army. The trade agreements that followed were significantly more favorable to the Ashanti than anything Denkyira had negotiated. European merchants paid higher prices for gold. They accepted restrictions on which territories they could access. They agreed to supply firearms to the Ashanti at rates that ensured Ashanti military superiority over any potential rival. And they did all of this because the alternative was losing access to the richest gold deposits in West Africa. Over the following years, Osei Tutu systematically expanded both the territory and the institutional sophistication of the Ashanti Empire. The road network was extended, connecting member states to Kumasi and to each other, facilitating both trade and the rapid deployment of military forces. A system of royal messengers was established, carrying communications across the empire with a speed and reliability that impressed European visitors decades later. The judicial system was formalized, with a hierarchy of courts that handled disputes at the local, regional, and national level. Cases that couldn't be resolved at lower levels were appealed to the Asante court in Kumasi, where Osei Tutu or his designated judges rendered decisions that were binding on all parties. The legal code balanced traditional Akan customary law with new regulations designed to manage the complexities of a multi-ethnic empire. The intelligence service that had proven so effective before Feyiase was expanded into a permanent institution. Agents operating under the cover of merchants, travelers, and diplomatic envoys gathered information about rival states, monitored the activities of European trading posts, and reported on internal developments within the Confederacy itself. Osei Tutu understood that an empire of this size and complexity required constant surveillance, not just of external threats, but of internal tensions that could fracture the unity he had worked so hard to create. Kumasi itself was transformed. The modest forest settlement that Osei Tutu had inherited grew into a genuine capital city, with broad streets, substantial buildings, and a palace complex that would astonish European visitors in the following century. The city became a center of trade, governance, and culture that attracted people from across the Gold Coast and beyond. Markets that had once been local affairs became regional commercial events, with merchants traveling from the coast, from the northern savannah, and from neighboring states to trade in Kumasi's increasingly prosperous marketplace. The transformation was comprehensive and it was rapid. Within 2 decades of the Battle of Feyiase, the Ashanti Empire had grown from a collection of forest chieftaincies into one of the most powerful states in West Africa. With a territory stretching from the coastal regions to the northern savannah, a population in the hundreds of thousands, a military that no regional power could challenge, and an economic system that generated wealth on a scale that rivaled pre-colonial states anywhere on the continent. Before we continue, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every week, we dig up stories that were deliberately buried. Rulers, warriors, and empires that the textbooks forgot. If you want to know what else they didn't tell you, subscribe. Now, back to Osei Tutu, because what happened next reveals both the genius of what he built and the one enemy that even the greatest builder cannot defeat. By 1715, Osei Tutu had spent roughly 35 years building the Ashanti Empire from nothing into the dominant power of the Gold Coast. He had unified warring chieftaincies through spiritual innovation. He had destroyed the Denkyira Empire in a single battle. He had constructed a political, economic, and military system sophisticated enough to manage a territory larger than many European kingdoms. He had outmaneuvered European traders who had centuries of commercial experience. And he had done all of it, starting from a position of absolute powerlessness, a hostage prince from an insignificant village who had nothing but his intelligence, his patience, and a priest who knew how to make people believe in the impossible. But empire, no matter how brilliantly constructed, is a hungry thing. It demands constant feeding. Rival states on the periphery test the borders. Internal tensions between member chiefs require constant management. Trade relationships with the Europeans require endless negotiation. And new threats emerge from directions that even the most careful intelligence network can't always anticipate. The Akiem people, positioned to the southeast of the Ashanti heartland, had been a persistent challenge since before Feyiase. The Akiem were themselves a significant military power, with a warrior tradition that rivaled the Ashanti and a fierce independence that resisted incorporation into any larger political structure. They had refused Osei Tutu's invitations to join the Confederacy. They had provided shelter to Denkyira loyalists fleeing after Feyiase. And they had conducted raids along the Ashanti's eastern border that were too large to ignore and too small to justify a full-scale military campaign. Osei Tutu had dealt with the Akiem through a combination of diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and limited military operations for over a decade. He restricted their access to European trade goods. He supported their internal rivals. He conducted punitive raids, that punished specific provocations without committing to a full conquest. It was a strategy of containment designed to neutralize the Akiem threat without the cost and risk of a major war. By 1717, the situation had escalated beyond what containment could manage. The Akiem had formed an alliance with several smaller states that resented Ashanti dominance. They had acquired European firearms through trade networks that bypassed Ashanti-controlled routes. And their raids had grown bolder, targeting not just border villages, but important trade caravans, carrying gold and goods that the Ashanti economy depended upon. Osei Tutu decided that the time for containment had passed. He assembled an Ashanti army and marched east to deal with the Akiem decisively. It was the kind of campaign he had conducted many times before, and by this point in his reign, the Ashanti military machine was a well-oiled instrument of imperial power. His generals were experienced. His logistics were sophisticated. His intelligence networks had mapped the Akiem positions and identified their probable defensive strategies. What nobody anticipated, what no intelligence network could have predicted, was what happened at the crossing of the Pra River. The Ashanti army reached the Pra, a significant waterway that marked the boundary between Ashanti-controlled territory and Akiem lands. River crossings are among the most dangerous moments in any military campaign. An army in the process of crossing a river is at its most vulnerable, split between two banks, unable to form proper defensive positions, with soldiers waist-deep in water, unable to use their weapons effectively. Every military commander in history has understood this. Osei Tutu understood it better than most. He had scouts reconnoiter the crossing points. He had advance units secure the far bank before the main body began crossing. He took the standard precautions that any competent commander would take. But the Akiem had prepared something that the scouts hadn't detected. Sharpshooters, hidden in the dense forest on the far bank, positioned in trees and behind natural cover with clear sightlines to the river crossing. They had been in position for days, waiting with the patience of hunters who knew exactly what kind of prey was coming. Osei Tutu was in the river when the first shots rang out. The accounts of what happened next are fragmentary and contradictory, pieced together from oral traditions that reflect the chaos and grief of the moment. Some traditions say Osei Tutu was hit by the first volley, struck by a musket ball while he was waist-deep in the current, surrounded by his bodyguard, but exposed by the simple physics of a river crossing that offered no cover. Others say the initial volley missed him, that he tried to rally his forces, that he was hit during a second or third volley as the ambush continued and the river turned red with the blood of his soldiers. What every tradition agrees on is the outcome. Osei Tutu, the founder of the Ashanti Empire, the man who had built a nation from a stool and a story, died in the Pra River. He was approximately 57 years old. He had reigned for roughly 37 years. And he died not in the grand climactic battle that legends demand, but in a messy, chaotic river ambush, the kind of engagement where luck and timing matter more than genius. The immediate aftermath was a crisis that tested everything Osei Tutu had built. In most empires of this period, in Africa and elsewhere, the death of the founding ruler triggered an immediate struggle for succession that frequently destroyed the state itself. Generals turned on each other. Vassal states rebelled. The empire fragmented into competing factions that consumed more energy fighting each other than they had ever spent fighting external enemies. This is what happened to Alexander the Great's empire. This is what happened to Genghis Khan's domains. This is what happened to Shaka Zulu's kingdom after his assassination. This is what happened to Amina's Zazao. It is, historically speaking, the normal outcome, the expected outcome, almost the inevitable outcome. It is not what happened to the Ashanti Empire. Osei Tutu's commanders made a decision that revealed the depth of institutional culture he had embedded in the Ashanti system. They kept his death secret. For days, as the army withdrew from the Pra River, the soldiers were told that the Asante Hene had been wounded but was recovering in his litter. The bodyguard that normally surrounded Osei Tutu maintained their positions around a covered litter that carried his body rather than a living king. The pretense was maintained until the army had safely returned to Ashanti territory, preventing the panic and disintegration that the news of the king's death would have triggered in the field. When the death was finally announced in Kumasi, the succession process that Osei Tutu had established functioned exactly as he had designed it. The Queen Mother, the Council of Elders, and the chiefs of the Confederacy convened to select the next Asantehene. There was debate. There were competing candidates. There were the inevitable political maneuvers and factional negotiations. But the process was orderly. It was constitutional. It followed established procedures that every participant understood and accepted. Opoku Ware was selected as the new Asantehene. He was a nephew of Osei Tutu, a capable military commander and a politically astute leader who understood both the system he was inheriting and the challenges it faced. The transition of power was smooth. The member states of the Confederacy maintained their allegiance. The army remained intact and functional. The trade relationships with the European coastal forts continued without interruption. The Ashanti Empire didn't just survive Osei Tutu's death, it thrived. Under Opoku Ware, the empire expanded further, conquering new territories and incorporating new peoples into the Confederacy. The military system that Osei Tutu had created proved adaptable to new challenges and new enemies. The political framework he had established proved flexible enough to accommodate growth without breaking. The Golden Stool continued to serve as the unifying symbol that bound the nation together across differences of region, clan, and interest. This is the single most remarkable aspect of Osei Tutu's legacy. Not the battles he won, not the empire he conquered, not the gold he controlled, the fact that what he built survived him. He had studied the failures of other empires during his years of exile. He had seen how Denkyira's centralized, personality-driven system created a single point of failure that the Battle of Feyiase had exploited catastrophically. He understood that an empire built around one man dies with that man. So he built something different. He built institutions. He built systems. He built a political framework that distributed power broadly enough that no single death could collapse the structure. He built a spiritual identity so deep and so widely shared that it couldn't be severed by cutting down any individual trunk, because the roots extended into every household, every village, every heart in the Ashanti nation. Osei Tutu solved the problem that destroyed almost every other personal empire in history. He made himself replaceable, and in doing so, he made his creation immortal, or as close to immortal as any human institution can be. The Ashanti Empire that Osei Tutu founded would endure for nearly 200 years after his death, and during those 2 centuries, it would face the most formidable challenge that any African state could encounter: the full weight of the British Empire. The Anglo-Ashanti Wars are among the most remarkable military conflicts in the history of colonialism. Between 1824 and 1900, the British fought 4 separate wars against the Ashanti, a record of sustained resistance that no other African state could match. 4 wars, spanning 76 years, against the most powerful empire on the planet. The fact that it took the British 4 attempts to subdue the Ashanti tells you everything you need to know about the quality of what Osei Tutu built. The First War, in 1824, ended in a British defeat so humiliating that the British governor, Sir Charles McCarthy, was killed in battle and, according to both Ashanti and British sources, his skull was subsequently used as a ceremonial drinking cup by the Ashanti king. The British had marched into the Gold Coast interior, expecting to intimidate a primitive tribal force into submission. They encountered an organized, disciplined, well-armed empire that met them in the field and destroyed them. The Second War, in 1863, ended in a stalemate after the British found that punitive expeditions into the forest interior were logistically nightmarish and militarily indecisive. Ashanti forces used guerrilla tactics in the dense forest terrain that neutralized British advantages in firepower and formation fighting. The British burned Kumasi but couldn't hold it, and the Ashanti rebuilt their capital and their military within months of the British withdrawal. The Third War, in 1873–74, was the most destructive. The British assembled a professional expeditionary force under Sir Garnet Wolseley, one of the most capable British generals of the Victorian era. Wolseley approached the campaign with a seriousness that reflected hard-learned lessons from previous failures. He brought modern rifles, artillery, Gatling guns, and engineering units capable of building roads through the forest. He also brought African allies from states that resented Ashanti dominance, creating a coalition designed to isolate the Ashanti politically while overwhelming them militarily. Wolseley reached Kumasi and burned it again. The Ashanti king was forced to accept a treaty that imposed significant territorial and economic concessions. But even Wolseley couldn't destroy the Ashanti state. He couldn't find the Golden Stool. And the moment his forces withdrew, the Ashanti began rebuilding again. The fourth and final war, in 1900, produced a story that Osei Tutu himself would have recognized as a worthy successor to everything he built. The British governor of the Gold Coast, Sir Frederick Hodgson, travelled to Kumasi and committed an act of such staggering cultural ignorance that it united the Ashanti population in a fury that erased decades of internal disagreement. In a public meeting with Ashanti leaders, Hodgson demanded that the Golden Stool be brought to him so he could sit on it as a symbol of British authority over the Ashanti. The room went silent. Every Ashanti person present understood what Hodgson did not. The Golden Stool was not a chair, it was the soul of the nation. No human being sat on the Golden Stool, not even the Asantehene. For a foreign governor to demand to sit on it was not merely an insult. It was an existential threat. If the British took the stool, the nation would die. Everything Osei Tutu had built, everything that had survived 2 centuries of warfare and colonial pressure, would be destroyed. The response came from a woman, Ya Asantewa, the Queen Mother of the Ejisu district, one of the most powerful traditional female positions in the Ashanti system, stood before the assembled chiefs and spoke words that ignited the final Anglo-Ashanti war. If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight. We will fight till the last of us falls in the battlefields. The War of the Golden Stool, as it became known, lasted from March to September 1900. Ya Asantewa personally led Ashanti forces in a siege of the British fort at Kumasi that lasted months. The British garrison nearly starved. Reinforcements had to fight their way through Ashanti-controlled territory to relieve the siege, suffering significant casualties along the way. When British reinforcements finally broke through in sufficient numbers to tip the military balance, the Ashanti resistance continued through guerrilla operations that lasted for months after the siege ended. The British eventually prevailed through overwhelming force, modern weapons, and the sheer logistical capacity of an industrial empire fighting a pre-industrial state. Ya Asantewa was captured and exiled to the Seychelles Islands, where she died in 1921. The Ashanti state was formally annexed to the Gold Coast colony, but the British never got the Golden Stool. The Ashanti hid it. They buried it in a location known only to a handful of trusted custodians and maintained the secret through decades of colonial rule. British search parties scoured the forest. Rewards were offered. Informants were cultivated. None of it worked. The stool that Okomfo Anokye had called down from the sky remained hidden, protected by the same spiritual authority that had brought a nation into existence 2 centuries earlier. The stool was accidentally discovered by road workers in 1921, but Ashanti leaders quickly recovered it and negotiated with the British to keep it in Ashanti custody. The British, who had by this point learned painful lessons about the consequences of disrespecting Ashanti sacred objects, agreed. When Ghana gained independence from Britain in 1957, the Ashanti Kingdom was incorporated into the new nation as a constituent region with significant cultural autonomy. The Golden Stool remained at the center of Ashanti identity, still treated with the same reverence that Okomfo Anokye had demanded 3 centuries earlier. Today, the Asantehene still rules in Kumasi, still derives his authority from the Golden Stool, and still participates in ceremonies that would be recognizable to the chiefs who sat in that forest clearing in 1701 and watched a golden throne descend from the heavens. The Golden Stool still exists. It sits in the Ashanti royal palace in Kumasi, on its own throne, on its own blanket, in its own room. It is brought out for the most sacred national ceremonies and displayed to the Ashanti people as the living symbol of their collective identity. No one sits on it. No one has ever sat on it. Not the first Asantehene. Not the current one. Not anyone in between. Because the Golden Stool doesn't belong to any king. It belongs to a nation that didn't exist until 2 men, a homeless prince and a brilliant priest, decided to imagine it into being. A nation that survived the death of its founder, the burning of its capital, 4 wars against the most powerful empire on earth, and 75 years of colonial rule. A nation that exists today in the hearts of millions of Ashanti people around the world because of a ceremony in a forest clearing 300 years ago. Osei Tutu was born into a world that told him he was nothing, a minor prince from a minor chieftaincy, crushed under the boot of an empire that treated his people as a resource to be mined. He was sent away as a hostage, expected to be broken, expected to learn obedience. Instead, he learned warfare, he learned politics, he learned the weaknesses of the powerful and the untapped strength of the oppressed. He found a partner whose genius matched his own. He went home with nothing but a plan and the conviction that his people deserved better than the world they had been given. He built a nation from belief. He destroyed an empire in an afternoon. He created a political system sophisticated enough to survive his own death by 2 centuries. He outmaneuvered European traders who thought they were dealing with a primitive. He constructed an identity so powerful that the world's greatest empire needed 4 wars and 76 years to subdue it, and even then, it couldn't destroy the soul of the nation because the soul was hidden in a golden stool that the Ashanti people protected with their lives. That's the real legacy of Osei Tutu, not the gold, not the battles, not the territory, the idea. The radical, revolutionary, magnificent idea that a scattered people could become one nation if they believed in something larger than themselves. That unity, real unity, is not a political arrangement, but a spiritual commitment. That a shared identity, properly constructed and genuinely felt, is stronger than any army, more durable than any fortress, more valuable than any treasury. 300 years later, the stool he and Anokye created is still the most sacred object in Ashanti culture. 300 years later, his descendants still rule from the capital he built. 300 years later, the nation he imagined still exists, still remembers, still believes. Not many founders can claim that. Not many empires last that long. Not many stories survive 3 centuries and still carry the power to make you understand something fundamental about what human beings are capable of when they choose to be more than what the world tells them they can be. If this story changed how you think about African history, about empire, about what it takes to build something that lasts, then hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because every single week we dig into stories that the world wanted to forget. Kings, queens, warriors and visionaries whose names should be taught in every school on earth but got erased by people who found their achievements inconvenient. And here's what I want to know from you. Drop it in the comments. What holds your people together? What symbol, what story, what belief connects you to something larger than yourself? Because that's Osei Tutu's real lesson. Nations aren't built from territory, they're built from meaning. Find the meaning, and you can build anything.